My name is Amanda Lewis, and I'm the director of UIC's Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. I'd like to begin today by introducing our provost, Susan Poser. Dr. Poser became the provost and vice chancellor for academic affairs at the University of Illinois at Chicago in February of 2016. So it's been 2 years. Wow. Prior to coming to UIC, Dr. Poser was the dean at the University of Nebraska College of Law, where she was also a faculty member for many years. During her 2 years at UIC, Provost Poser has focused on cutting down on bureaucracy, creating programs to support faculty growth in teaching and research, providing opportunities for the East and West side faculty to interact and collaborate, supporting the Student Success Initiative in order to increase the retention and graduation rate of students, and through campus conversation, creating opportunities for the whole campus to come together to discuss significant issues that affect the lives of UIC students, faculty, and staff. She's also been a very good friend to IRRPP since she's been here, and join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and to welcome all of you to the University of Illinois at Chicago. A special welcome to our invited Philip Bowman lecturer, Dr. Mary Pattillo from Northwestern University, and of course, also a very special welcome to Dr. Philip Bowman. We're delighted to have you back. And he's joined today by his son, Du Bois Bowman, who's a professor at biostats at Columbia, who came today to be here with us. I also want to give a special welcome to the community leaders and members of Chicago civic organizations who are joining us this afternoon, as well, of course, as our UIC faculty, students, and staff. The Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy was created in the 1990s to address the low representation of people of color throughout the university. IRRPP has a mission to increase society's understanding of the root causes of racial and ethnic inequality and to provide the public, organizers, practitioners, and policymakers with research-based policy solutions. The Institute has been going strong for over 20 years and has served the campus and the community as a place of intellectual inquiry, evidence-based research, and strategic thinking. Amanda Lewis, who just spoke to you, IRRPP's director, continues the legacy with her visionary and collaborative leadership and her dedication to providing opportunity and mentorship to our faculty. In May 2017, the IRRPP published a report titled A Tale of Three Cities, The State of Racial Justice in Chicago. This report examines the changing conditions of Chicago's three largest racial and ethnic groups, Blacks, Latinx, and whites, over the last half century. It finds that ethnic and racial inequities in Chicago are deeply rooted in history and remain pervasive, persistent, and consequential, strongly embedded in today's society, which of course we all know. Using evidence-based, concrete terms, the report assesses the challenges and the opportunities for Chicago residents and offers accessible data and analysis, providing an excellent resource for developing new research projects and creating policy solutions. I have read it. I have shared it with many people, lots of people who come to my office, as Amanda knows, because I keep asking for more copies, including members of the Obama Foundation, who are very excited about using it as they begin programming. Now, maybe this has always been true, but it feels like now more than ever, we need centers like the IRRPP to offer a community of scholars to support their intellectual endeavors around issues of race, to collaborate with community organizers on social justice projects, and to explore the gaps between policy and racial injustice. UIC is, as we like to say, not the University of Illinois at Chicago, but the University of Illinois for Chicago. Issues of race, justice, and public policy are the highest priority at UIC because of who we are and because of whom we educate. As an institution, we have a deep and abiding commitment to the work of the IRRPP, which provides long-term and sustained efforts to address the most important issues of our time and to leverage our collective skills in research and community outreach. There is no nobler cause, and never has been, at this university or, of course, in this country. So again, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to an interesting and engaging afternoon. Now back to Amanda.
Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce in a moment our speaker today for the annual Philip J. Bowman Lecture on Race, Ethnicity, and Public Policy. The Bowman Lecture focuses on providing timely analysis of issues of race, equity, and justice facing us today. And the lecture is, of course, named after the first permanent director of IRPP, Philip J. Bowman, both because of his important leadership of the Institute and because of his prolific record as a scholar. All of us who have benefited from the work of IRPP over the last 15 years owe a debt of gratitude to Phil for his careful and strategic nurturance of this institute at its beginning. He set a strong foundation that has enabled IRPP to serve its mission to serve as an important intellectual hub here in Chicago for cutting-edge research on racial and ethnic dynamics that is deeply engaged with not only trying to understand but to transform the conditions of underrepresented groups. Dr. Bowman is currently a professor of higher education at the University of Michigan, where he is also director of the Diversity Research and Policy Program, as well as faculty associate at the Institute for Social Research and the National Poverty Center. He's always had, it seems, at least 3 jobs, and that continues. Dr. Bowman's scholarship focuses on racial and ethnic diversity, higher education, and related policy issues, including workforce opportunity, urban poverty, family distress, and health inequities. He's also taking national leadership in pursuing conversations about strengths-based interventions to reduce inequalities, disparities, and opportunity gaps. I am lucky to have known him now for over 20 years. He's the ultimate intellectual and scholar, just deeply and sincerely interested in the world and people's stories, and in understanding why things are the way they are and how to transform them in ways that create opportunity. Everywhere I go, and I literally mean everywhere, I run into amazing colleagues who narrate a story of receiving important mentoring, counsel, and advice from Dr. Bowman at some key point in their academic journey. Whether at Urbana, Northwestern, UIC, Michigan, whether they were high school students at the time, undergraduates, graduate students, junior faculty, he has a deep and lasting impact on so many people personally and on higher education as an institution because of his capacity to guide folks, to help them to understand how these institutions work or don't, how they can be successful in them, and in conveying in ways that young and vulnerable scholars can understand that he believes they can be successful. Dr. Bowman is a model for me and many others of what it means to operate with brilliance, integrity, and skill, and we are very honored he could be with us here today. So thank you, Phil, very much. End of all. Before introducing Dr. Pattillo, I also would like to thank the provost, our staff, and the campus and community partners for making possible not only today's talk, but all the work we do at the Institute. I also want to thank you for being with us today and encourage you to consider how you or your organization can become collaborators in our work. I also want to mention briefly, many of you have probably seen there's a little book mark on your seat. If you haven't seen it, it just is about another initiative we have right now, the Summer Education Workshop. The registration just opened this week. Brings together K-12 teachers and educators interested in advancing racial justice in classrooms for a 4-day workshop this coming summer. And if you have any questions, please let one of the staff know. Now, I get to introduce our speaker. The provost mentioned earlier a report we published last year on the state of racial justice in Chicago, and when we sat down to think about the Bowman speaker this year, we wanted somebody who has been deeply engaged in thinking about Chicago, about racial politics in Chicago, and about the future of Chicago for a long time. And immediately, one of the people that came to the top of the list, of course, was Dr. Pattillo. It also speaks to Phil's lasting legacy that when we reached out, she immediately said she would be honored to be the Bowman speaker. Thus, on International Women's Day, it's my privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Mary Pattillo, the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. Her path-breaking work uses Chicago as a laboratory to explore the entanglements of racial, ethnic, and class inequalities as these intersect with urban space and gentrification, the criminal justice system, youth socialization, and economic politics and policy. In her book, Black Picket Fences, Pattillo investigates the economic, spatial, and cultural forces that affect childbearing and youth socialization in a Black middle-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. This book won several major awards from different professional associations. Her second book, Black on the Block, focused on gentrification and public housing transformation in North Kenwood, Oakland, on Chicago's South Side. Her book explores the roles that Black professionals play in working alternatively to mediate or exacerbate racial and class inequality. It also won several awards. Dr. Pattillo has received numerous other acknowledgments and awards and honors. I could spend a lot of time talking about all of them. She received her doctorate from the University of Chicago. Her current research projects include the effect of college match on racial and class stratification and the prevalence and impact of monetary sanction in the Illinois criminal justice system. She also does a great deal of work in the community, including such thing as being a founding board member and active participant in Urban Prep Charter Academy, the first all-boys public charter school, and serving on the board of the Chicago Community Trust African American Legacy Fund. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pattillo here today.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Dr. Poser, for being here and welcoming me. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and thanks to Dr. Bowman, especially, for being here. We all have our Dr. Bowman stories, and mine begins at a track meet, his daughter's track meet, which I don't quite know how I ended up there. I think it was Al Young. But it was special to meet someone of such importance at a very informal, in a very informal space. But as I'm sure many of you all know, it's not difficult to get very informal with Dr. Bowman pretty quickly. You can talk about everything from his brilliance to, to track meets and many other things. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I also feel like we've so much walked on the same ground. Professor Bowman was at Northwestern, where I am now. I did a postdoc at Michigan, where I met him. Now I'm here at UIC, where he was for many years and where this lecture has been named for him. So it's really, really, really an honor. Thank you very much for choosing me and for being here, and for your son being here as well. 1,197,000. That was Chicago's Black population in 1980. 834,073. That's Chicago's Black population in 2016. And I say generously for those demographers in the audience who are like, that's not the right number. I say generously because there I include Black Latinos and Black alone or in combination for you census nerds out there. So anybody with any bit of Black in them. So that's our generous number. The difference between those two numbers, 362,927. And comparing that difference to the population, the Black population of Washington, D.C. today. Washington, D.C., Chocolate City. Not anymore, but it was. The Black population of Washington, D.C. today is 320,000. So over that 36-year period, Chicago has lost as many Black people as Washington, D.C. has today. This is not, I don't think, news to many people who read the news. This has been in the headlines for many years now. But why do these numbers evoke emotions? Why do these numbers evoke sadness for me? A city, after all, is nothing more than administrative and political boundaries, relatively arbitrary. Why should I care if Black folks live in Chicago or Phoenix or Jackson or New York or Atlanta or Seattle or the suburbs of any of those cities? It was 2012 when whites in Chicago surpassed Blacks as the largest racial group in the city. And it was 2016 when Hispanics surpassed African Americans as the second largest racial group in the city. And I admit that both announcements made me slouch in my chair as I read them. Chicago has never been a chocolate city, meaning it's never been over 50% Black. But its Black reputation has always been larger than its Black representation. Not lost on me is the fact that my sense of defeat is not too different from the sentiments that are frequently attributed to Trump supporters, whose Make America Great Again slogan is often analyzed by liberals to mean Make America White Again. So am I arguing make Chicago black again? Well, just as America was never a white country, Chicago was never a black city. And even if it was, such a refrain suffers from the same resistance to change and to difference and to community building across difference that Trump's slogan does. But that sober-minded analysis doesn't make my ache go away. And it doesn't because there is something more going on here. Chicago's black population decline is not simply a demographic observation of fertility, mortality, and migration. It has causes and consequences. Black population decline connects to a history and foretells a future. So today what I'll do is connect that future of black Chicago to its past using St. Clair Drake and Horace Katyn's masterpiece 1945 book, Black Metropolis. Many of the insights from that book remain relevant and applicable today. I'll then talk about today and highlight some of the public policies that have instigated black population loss, as well as the life that such loss represents. And then I'll end more briefly and speculatively, since I don't think sociologists are good in the speculative realm, about the future of black Chicago. Drake and Katyn employ W.E.B. Du Bois's trope of the color line. They write, Drake and Katyn, quote, "The history of the Negro in Midwest metropolis, like the history of the Negro in America, is the story of a conflict between the principles of American democracy and the existence of a color line." So this color line is a metaphor for the mechanisms and practices that maintain racial inequality, as well as a more literal description of the many places and systems in which blacks are on one side and whites are on the other side of a visible or sometimes of an invisible and sometimes visible color line. Blacks predominate in one job niche, whites in another. Blacks attend one set of churches, whites another. Blacks comprise one set of families, whites another. Obviously, there's overlap and intermingling, but here in the city of Chicago, unfortunately one of the more segregated cities in the country, I don't think is difficult to make the argument that the color line has been an organizing principle in Chicago for decades and remains so today. The effect of this segregation and subordination is the absence of free competition and the imposition of a fixed status. This is Drake and Katyn's second analytical argument. A grossly unequal playing field, they argue, curtails blacks' free competition with whites for housing, jobs, schools, open space, business patrons, and other important goods and services. And here I will just once again highlight the important work that Amanda Lewis and her colleagues here at UIC have done in putting out the most recent report, because I think there is no better documentation of exactly this fixed status than that report. This fixed status is enforced by prescribing movement across neighborhoods, by restraining interracial social interactions, and by inhibiting job mobility. The Black Ghetto, as Drake and Katyn call it in their book, they also call it the Black Belt occasionally, is the spatial manifestation of this fixed status, while Black Metropolis, which they also call Bronzeville, is how black people live within that reality. Drake and Katyn's third important contribution is that these two terms are not interchangeable. The Black Ghetto is the physical space into which blacks are segregated. It is a place of subordination, since the housing stock is older and substandard, since the provision of public service is wanting, since illness is rampant, since schools are in disrepair, and many of the other, again, things that the report that we mentioned earlier document. Black Metropolis, on the other hand, is what black folks create out of the Black Ghetto. It is a space of sociality, commerce, leisure, morality, debate, and meaning. In the book, Black Metropolis, examples abound in which Drake and Katyn differentiate these two concepts. For example, they write, quote, "Ghetto is a harsh term carrying overtones of poverty and suffering, of exclusion and subordination. In Midwest Metropolis, it is used by civic leaders when they want to shock complacency into action. Most of the ordinary people in the Black Belt refer to their community as the South Side, but everybody is also familiar with another name for the area, Bronzeville. On the one side then is the Black Ghetto, on the other is Black Metropolis, the South Side, and Bronzeville. And this nomenclature is a subtle but crucial intervention. Outsiders have a hard time seeing Bronzeville. All they see is the Black Ghetto. Drake and Katyn capture the life that happens within Bronzeville through their fourth analytical framework, what they call the axes of life. Staying alive, having fun, serving God, getting ahead, and advancing the race are what Drake and Katyn call the dominating interests within Black Metropolis. The imposition and enforcement of the Black Ghetto cannot overshadow the organizing, the lovemaking, the thinking, the hustling, and the signifying of Black Metropolis. In the book, the authors provide colorful and sometimes even embarrassing detail about how people do it in Bronzeville. And there are all kinds of characters, characters and activities, bridge and bid whist, wild children, sororities and fraternities, the Rosenwell departments and the Ida B. Wells homes, terms that are now out of fashion like Rhineys and Blue Vein and high-toned people, race men, social clubs, the double duty dollar, jobs, jackleg preachers, shouters and non-shouters, Dicty Negroes, and shadies. I'm sure we could fill in all of those terms with whatever is the language today. Those same people exist, we just call them different things today. So they're all there in Bronzeville, living life, making meaning, struggling, surviving, creating, not wholly preoccupied with the 281 pages of the book that introduced and described the pain and suffering in the Black Ghetto. So it really is two separate books, and that distinction is an important intervention. It is this duality that characterizes Black Chicago then and now. Despite the abundant laughter, Black Metropolis is still a place born of segregation and subordination. It is predicated on the Black Ghetto. Can Black Metropolis escape, overcome, or defeat the forced nature of the Black Ghetto? Can Black Metropolis thrive as a creative, generative, and healthy space, given that it originates from the racist determination that Black people be denied access to those very same things? This puzzle persists in the 21st century. Some Black Chicagoans answer that it's not possible. The suffering is too much, and escape is the only answer, even if that escape is short distance or short-lived. Others agree with that, but are trapped. They don't have the money to leave or can't find the place to escape to. And yet other Black voices hold out hope for the possibility and triumph of Black Metropolis. They cling to their families, their churches, their neighbors, their stores, and their streets. They cling to a South Side that provides just enough nourishment to stay alive and to stay put. How can we think about these insights from Drake and Katyn today? Are there public policies that capitalize on the segregation and subordination and thus further suffering in Black Chicago? And I argue that there definitely are. The subprime mortgage market and mortgage crisis is one such policy. It follows a long history of housing and many other, obviously, injustices that has been documented in several books and articles, and it is acutely felt in many of the neighborhoods that comprise Black Chicago. The toxic cocktail of subprime lending, unemployment, and unmanageable mortgage payments has left a trail of foreclosures that have pockmarked neighborhoods across the city's south and west sides. For example, in 16 Chicago communities that are majority African American, 10% or more of the homes were in foreclosure between 2008 and 2012. In these situations of concentrated foreclosures, some banks have decided that walking away from the property is easier than trying to sell it in a foreclosure proceedings. And lest we think that these disparities have been left in the past and we are beyond the foreclosure crisis, what this figure shows, the darker areas are the areas with more foreclosure filings. This is data from 2015. And I mean, for those of you all who are census and map nerds, this will be easily readable to you, but obviously that's the lake on the right-hand side. You can't quite see the outline of the city of Chicago, but you can see the darker areas in the southern parts of the city of Chicago into the southern suburbs, and the darker areas in the near western, let me see, does this pointer work on the screen? No, it doesn't. In the near-in areas just on the west side, just west of downtown, and then the areas outside of that go into the western suburbs, so those are lighter shaded, and the north side is much lighter shaded altogether. So clearly this is not something that we're done with, and black communities still wrestle with the foreclosure crisis. So when these banks walk away, what we have is abandoned houses altogether. Here in Chicago, two journalists, Gallon and Maidenberg, report that as of 2013, Chicago had 33,902 vacant homes, which was a 22% increase from 2010. The culmination of these processes of foreclosure, dispossession, and abandonment has been a campaign of demolition. Orders to demolish houses rose from 119 such orders in 2010 to 859 such orders in 2013. When a Cook County commissioner was asked to describe the implications of the pending demolition of hundreds of abandoned properties, many of which were in predominantly black neighborhoods, she said, quote, "We see demo as a negative activity, like you're destroying things, you're taking away. But in some ways, it actually makes the surrounding things more valuable. It's almost like pruning a tree." The abandonment wrought by federal policies that allowed for such predatory lending now serves as a pretext for reimagined urban space built upon pruning, not only houses in both the private and the public sector, but also schools as well. And I'm not going to talk today about violence in Chicago. That is a whole nother talk and someone else's area of expertise. But I will just make the connection between the school closings and violence. You know, for young people to value life, their lives need to be valued. And one of the biggest messages that their lives are not valued is when the place that they spend most of their day, schools, are places that we are kind of wantonly closing down. I wrote a paper with a former graduate student where we did research in Newark, New Jersey around closing schools, and the most painful part of that research was listening to second and third graders internalize their school closing as if there must be something wrong with me if they're closing my school. So that leap is not, I don't think, a leap at all to say that young people don't feel valued when they see that we don't value the institutions where they spend most of their day. So these are the places and the people who are scapegoated for the decay. Such efforts are presented as progress and improvement. For example, legal scholar Patricia Williams writes, quote, "In the context of today's ghettos, inner cities, and those places doomed to be called the third world, policies often envision poor and dying populations as separate, distant, severable." So she also is recognizing this word like pruning, severable. Like pruning, these urban plans and policies either design to or don't care if they cut off, exclude, and displace. Of course, one of the most contemporary debates in Chicago policy and politics surrounds the Obama Presidential Center to be built in Jackson Park on the south side. Most recently, when Obama went to one of the public meetings about the center, he said, quote, "It is not my experience that the big problem on the south side has been too much development, too much economic activity, too many people being displaced. We've got such a long way to go in terms of economic development before you're going to see the prospect of significant gentrification. Malias Kids might have to worry about that." I have to think that Obama cannot believe that. First, rather than, quote, "a long way to go before you're even going to see the prospect of significant gentrification," the price increases have been swift and palpable. The two neighborhoods that abut the Obama Center are Woodlawn and South Shore. And this shows you the bluer areas are areas with price increases, and you see basically from 2016 to 2017, prices in Woodlawn have gone up somewhere between 60 and 70%. Second, it won't be Malias Kids who will have to worry about it. Malias Kids will be able to live wherever they want. But other black people's kids will have to worry about it. And should we not plan for them? I have studied gentrification on Chicago's South Side, specifically in the North Kenwood, Oakland neighborhood, and here are some numbers. My census tract, or the couple of blocks around my house, is 3902. The median home value in my census tract went up from $126,000 in 1990 to $568,000 in 2016. In this regard, that's a long time period, and that does represent the generational point that Obama is making. It might be Malias Kids that are the ones, not Malias Kids, somebody's kids that are the ones facing these price increases, but they come nonetheless. In the rental market, the prices have gone up from $691 to $935. Now, don't everybody think, oh, I should move to North Kenwood, Oakland because it's cheap down there, $935. That's well below the Chicago average for housing prices. But you also have to put this into context that there are fewer rental units overall. The home ownership rate has gone up from 20% to 53%. So this is a smaller portion. The rental property is a smaller proportion, and people who are moving there really need to think about those home prices as much as the rental prices. In studying gentrification, the history is clear. There is no mistaking. This process has been documented time and time again. And every new generation gets 20/20 vision when they're looking in hindsight. For my book on North Kenwood, Oakland, I interviewed someone who was involved with bringing a new school to the neighborhood. Like Obama, her job was to get community buy-in. And like today, the community was skeptical. She told me, now looking back, quote, "They basically saw what is now happening in the community. We were one of the first waves of that. I was saying, what's wrong? When I went there, there's nothing but empty lots. Shakespeare Elementary School is closed. Everything that is now a townhouse was a burned out lot. And I'm thinking, why wouldn't you want something? But they knew what was coming. And I was naive in saying, why wouldn't you want a school? I'd go to the meetings and they were just so contentious. And everything they said they were worried about happened." So looking back, this eager education advocate realizes that her eyes were both bright and clouded at the same time. She was filled with the enthusiasm of making a difference in a neighborhood that needed a lot of differences, to be sure, but blind to a future in which some people would not fit in after that change. Her reflections draw attention to the knowledge base of community organizers. In the case of the Obama Center, the working class residents and organizers come bearing a community benefits agreement. Pretty much every one of their demands can be backed up by research that shows that without promises, without safeguards, without legally binding requirements, The most disadvantaged residents of changing communities benefit the least. One way low-income folks in changing communities miss out is because they're just not there anymore to take advantage of the changes. Black population loss in other revitalizing parts of Black Chicago is visible in these maps. So this is Black Chicago in 1940. The darkest shaded areas are areas that are over 90% Black, and the grayer shaded areas, which you'll see in a minute, are areas that are over 50% Black. So in 1940, it's just the city of Chicago. That boundary on the outside is Cook County. So 1940, 1970, 1990, and I draw your attention to the area just south of downtown. So you see the little carved out area is Hyde Park. That's the mixed race neighborhood where the University of Chicago is, and just north of that is Bronzeville that Drake and Katyn talk about. And I draw your attention there and to the near west side neighborhoods also abutting downtown to see the difference in the following figure that shows lower Black population representation in those areas just abutting downtown. Do I see Harold Lucas back there? I thought I saw Harold Lucas? No, because this is something he loves to mention, how clairvoyant Drake and Katyn really were. Drake and Katyn wrote in the 1940s, quote, "Chicago's master plan calls for the eventual reclamation of the inner city, with a garden belt of privately financed medium rental apartments replacing the slums. Here it is hoped members of the new middle class will make their homes, close to the loop where they work, and well within the city limits. The blighted areas thus will be reclaimed." 1940s, they wrote that. So even in the 1940s, such plans and rumors of plans raised questions of where the Black people who lived in these reclaimed areas would move. Drake and Katyn quote one private real estate player as answering, quote, "We have no plans for them. Perhaps they can return to the South." Obama's statement that Malias Kids might have to worry about that is tantamount to saying we have no plans for them. But we must. If we want stable Black or diverse neighborhoods where original residents benefit from place-based strategies, then we must have plans to put the brakes on the market. So if there are any city planners, elected officials, foundation representatives, CDCs, or developers here in the audience, I would urge you to ask yourself, if you are working on such projects, what brakes do you have in place in areas where you are currently implementing a revitalization strategy? Right now, you're likely thinking about those places, just what Obama is saying about Woodlawn and South Shore, and just what the person I interviewed in North Kenwood, Oakland said when she was advocating for a new school. You're likely saying, this neighborhood is so bad. There's so much vacant land. The prices are so low. The poverty rate is so high. The market is so wary. It will never be prime real estate. But I promise you that day will come. It will. It will. So what are your strategies to put the brakes on revitalization? Inclusionary zoning is an at-minimum strategy to make sure that all of the new housing built is available for a range of families. But have you also created a community land trust? Are you preserving public housing and existing project-based Section 8 housing? Might you enact rent control? Are CDCs involved to control a significant stock of the housing in terms of management? Are there protections for businesses that serve low-income residents? Do you have property tax freezes, not just for senior citizens, but also for low-income owners? Have you thought about priority housing choice vouchers and low-income loans for current residents? If not, if you have not included ways to rein in the market, to stop those with more money, more legitimacy, or more power from having their way, then your words about revitalization and community investment are hollow. Part of the reason that Obama can say such things is because he is operating from a deficit model. Indeed, he is seeing only the Black ghetto and not Black metropolis. This is the same perspective taken by that Cook County commissioner. Comparing the destruction of houses in black neighborhoods and therefore the communities themselves to the mundane act of pruning a tree is to conceive of these places and the people who live in them as unproductive, as diseased, as obstructive, and as derelict spaces. But of course, the obliteration and attenuation of black spaces across Chicago threatens to eliminate significant cultural artifacts and contributions apparently unknown to city officials and others who speak of remaking Chicago as if it were a simple act of horticulture. We know that is not true. Black Chicagoans have always transformed violently enforced neighborhood boundaries into a black metropolis. As George Lipsitz says, black folks turn segregation into congregation. This is where St. Clair Drake and Horace Katyn's axes of life become an important framework. Again, staying alive, having fun, serving God, getting ahead, advancing the race. All of these simple yet deeply human endeavors, black folks do too. This is a Facebook announcement of the 2014 family reunion of the Stateway Gardens Public Housing Complex on Chicago's South Side. They come together annually to share the good and bad memories of life in the projects, to celebrate their lasting bonds of friendship and kinship, and to state their place in Chicago despite efforts to remove them. The last high-rise in Stateway Gardens was demolished in 2007. Most of the high-rise public housing in the city has gone the way of Stateway Gardens, demolished in order to make way for new developments that mix low, middle, and high-income families all together, along with new upscale businesses and amenities. Across the U.S., nearly 250,000 people have been displaced by public housing demolitions, and over 80% of them have been African American. And in Chicago, where the vast majority of public housing residents are black, Chicago has demolished more public housing than any other city in the U.S. Yet while the high-rises might be gone, the former residents pull back together, reconstitute their bonds, and relive their memories, performing important acts of placemaking through these reunions and other forms of virtual and in-person collective gathering. As the poet Maya Angelou says, "You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise." Reunions bring people back to a place, usually the exact same building, but those buildings are gone. There are no physical structures to go back to. Indeed, not only are the buildings gone, but the city planners have also discarded the original names. The Ida B. Wells homes have been renamed Oakwood Shores. The Jane Addams homes renamed Roosevelt Square. The Henry Horner homes, and I'm just going to assume that folks who know who Ida B. Wells and Jane Addams are, but let me go back. Ida B. Wells, journalist, anti-lynching crusader, freedom fighter all around, and Chicagoan for much of her time, now called Oakwood Shores. Jane Addams homes, immigrant rights worker, social worker, PhD, sociologist, researcher, renamed Roosevelt Square. And the Henry Horner homes, named for Illinois' first Jewish governor, has become West Haven Park. But Chicago city leaders haven't figured out how to make a place on the map completely disappear. And so residents come back somewhere as close as they can possibly get. In 2003, former residents of the Cabrini Green housing organized Old School Mondays. There's a great documentary by Ronit Bezalel on Cabrini Green. And in this small piece, it shows hundreds of people dancing in the park, hugging, barbecuing, exchanging phone numbers, watching children. People are elated to be back on familiar ground. There's a clip where one woman begins, "It's about home." And another woman says, "Cabrini's always gonna be home." And the first one jumps back in, even though it's not physically here. And the second one finishes her sentence, "But as long as we're around each other, we're feeling it still." So in addition to bringing people together, reunions are also about memories, and there are so many memories about public housing. One Facebook post pays tribute to a recently deceased drama teacher from the public school that many of the kids from Stateway Gardens had attended. She wrote, quote, "I was one of his favorites when I was a kid, and he pushed me to strive to be the best. cracking that whip on me to deliver weeks of memorable performances of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. I wonder if he knew what his contributions and dedication meant to us all. Yes, black children in the projects do school plays too. At the height of their occupancy in the 1970s, Chicago family public housing was officially home to 137,000 people, most of them African American. And when you think about the squatters and unofficial residents, the total was probably about 40% higher. So officially 137,000. In 2012, the population in family public housing in Chicago was just over 23,000 residents. This drastic population loss is also what was shown in that figure where I showed the maps of Chicago and those near-in neighborhoods losing black population. But despite this drastic population loss, spaces of black communal life have been reconstituted through these reunions and through these online spaces and these spaces of memory. In other words, the disappearing of black public housing residents in Chicago was unsuccessful. Even amongst the children of former residents, they proclaim their public housing lineage. One woman on Facebook wrote a tag under her picture of her father and her standing in front of a mural at the Robert Taylor homes, and she wrote, quote, "Me and my pops at the Robert Taylor homes reunion. He grew up in building number 4101. Had to capture that." So second generation, although she had not grown up, she's still claiming it because of her father. But it is the pithiest of slogans that insist on making and claiming place in the city. "Fuck you, I'm from Robert Taylor Homes," announces this mem on Facebook with the comment below, "Better know it." So no matter the disregard, the disparagement, the disdain, the demolition, the pruning, Black Chicago still rises in celebration and pleasure, practicing one of these axes of life, simply having fun, and doing it with righteous indignation. So the future of Black Chicago. Gwendolyn Brooks writes in her poem, "The word black has geographic power, pulls everybody in. Blacks here, blacks there, blacks wherever they may be." So I truly hope that is the case as Chicago's black population declines, and I truly believe that is the case as well. In many cities, the increasing attraction of the central city areas that black metropolis occupies is a constant threat to its existence. And it's a phenomenon that Drake and Katyn acutely predicted. But up until now, at least, rather than scattering and totally disappearing when the place that black folks live becomes prime real estate, black folks reconstitute black metropolis somewhere else. Harlem and Bed-Stuy moved to Jamaica and Corona, Queens, and Yonkers as well. Overton and Liberty City in Miami, decimated by highway construction and other urban renewal projects, moved to Carroll City. Philadelphia's 7th Ward moves to West and North Philly. West Oakland moves to Richmond, California. And Black Chicago moves to Country Club Hills and Maywood, and if we are honest, Atlanta. Every move makes Black metropolis that much more fragile, losing some souls to areas beyond its borders altogether. Nationally, indeed, most Black people don't live in majority Black neighborhoods. But as Gwendolyn Brooks tells us, Black metropolis still has geographic power. On Sundays, as Omar McRoberts tells us, many Black families return to Black neighborhoods for church. Black professionals, as Celeste Watkins Hayes tells us, disproportionately work as teachers, social workers, police officers, and welfare bureaucrats, keeping them closely tied to Black Chicago. And even when Blacks live in predominantly white neighborhoods, as Karen Lacey tells us, they create improvised Black Chicagos by joining Black social groups and building Black organizations, especially for Black children and families. There are also non-geographic manifestations of Black Chicago to think about. Chicago Southsider Nate Marshall writes in his poem, Repetition and Repetition, and, quote, "We are limited to the hood until we decide we are not. And when we decide we are not, we reconstitute spaces in virtual reality as well. As sociologist Zandra Robinson likes to quote, she quotes Erykah Badu, who sings, quote, "We ain't dead yet, we've been living through your internet." So thinking about spaces online, through Black Twitter, through Black social media, through Black Facebook, these are new faces and places for Black Chicago. And then I have another point before my last point that I just thought about as I was driving down here, that I haven't been able to do the research about, so I'd be curious about it, which is thinking about Black immigrants to Chicago. What I need to find, which is easily findable, but I didn't have time, is while the Black population in Chicago has gone down, I would be curious to know if the Black foreign-born population is going up. So Chicago right now ranks 9th of the top 10 cities in the proportion of its Black population that is foreign-born. 4% of Chicago's Black population is foreign-born, which puts it well behind New York and DC and so on and so forth. Puts us right above Detroit. So we are by and large Black American population, not Black foreign-born. But as we, both on the south side and on the north side, folks from Nigeria and from Ghana and from Jamaica. Matter of fact, I was just looking at the best Black restaurant in Chicago, which I found online. And it's a Guyanese restaurant on 87th Street. And I was like, what? So I'm gonna make it over there. But this is, I think, something to think about when we think about the future of Black Chicago. It surely is the future of Black New York. It surely is the future of Black Houston. And the question is, can it also be, and what does Chicago need to do to make it also part of the future of Black Chicago? And in the Black Chicago that persists, Drake and Katyn, because after all, we're still at 835 million, thousand. Million, I'm gonna go with that. Million, no, 835,000 Black folks in the city of Chicago, which is still a very large number. And in the Black Chicago that persists, Drake and Katyn's framework offers a broad corrective to the imbalanced social science, and I would argue policy, attention on Black communities, which often portrays urban Black residents in their neighborhoods as pathological, dangerous, depressing. It's how folks see the Black ghetto and never see Black metropolis. But the fact that Black Chicago is characterized by these axes of life counters this narrative by focusing on the agency, the intent, the spontaneity, the creativity in these spaces, the sustaining, affirming, and pleasurable components of living in Black Chicago. So when we focus on Black life, we can't curtail or do away with the research on the racism that continues to undermine the ability of Black folks to live peacefully and productively in the city. Instead, by focusing on these axes of life, the goal of highlighting this is to offer a reminder that all Black spaces are not overgrown or unruly or derelict or destructive in need of pruning. They're not inherently inferior, for which the only remedy is demolition or class or race integration. To the contrary, if life in Black Chicago is as fun and as witty and as soulful and as biting and as rejuvenating and as well-dressed, remember that picture from the public housing reunion, as those public housing reunions and many other examples, imagine what it could be in a more just and equitable city. And I'll stop there and open it up. So you want me to take questions? Mm-hmm.
You're in charge.
Mm-hmm.
This thought isn't really totally fully formed. Oh, sure. My question isn't totally fully formed, but I'm just going to get it out there. I just want to say that I really appreciated this talk. There's, such an important lack of pessimism. Afro-pessimism is all the rage these days, and there's such a lack of pessimism in this talk, a focus on Black life. I feel like I know more, and with that I can do more, after this talk. So I just want to say thank you so much. And I guess my question is about the role of, Black elites and Black politicians, Black policymakers in this conversation. I think that the Obama, presidential library fight is one that I'm certainly watching as a, museum worker. And this is the part that's not formed yet. I guess, as this, historically, maybe what have been the responses of, Black aldermen, of Black politicians to this erasure of Black space in Chicago, and what's the future of maybe Black political Chicago or the Black political class here? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay,
definitely. So first, let me just say thank you very much. You said, I feel like I know more, and there's no better compliment to a professor than somebody knows more. So thank you very much. That's really probably the best compliment I could get. So your question is very near and dear to my heart in Black on the Block. The whole book is really about the role of Black professionals, of that group that I call middle men and middle women who broker change in neighborhoods, broker the politics that affect Black communities, broker resources, mortgage dollars and foundation funds and grants and so on and so forth. And my analysis, first of all, I like the way you framed the question about historically and kind of the present. So first, let me say, I don't think that what we're hearing from Obama or from what we're seeing in this particular debate is an historical rupture, for example. Much of Drake and Katyn and the work all from Drake and Katyn up to the present will show that Black politics has always been diverse and varied and contentious, and it's not in the singular, but always in the plural. And so I think we're seeing that legacy today, and I think the amount of power and that someone like Obama has is unprecedented. Obviously, we never had a Black president before, and then that Black president comes back to a city and kind of wields that kind of the fundraising power and so on and so forth. So I do think that is a break, but the content of the debates I don't think are that much different. What I try to argue, I don't have a hard answer for the question. I just try to lay out kind of what the analytical landscape looks like. So I don't want to paint all Black middle men and middle women as I use this trope of middle men and middle women to then talk about the little man and the man, and that sometimes Black middle men and middle women are aligned more with the man, and sometimes they're aligned more with the little man, and that's the same person can have different alignments over different moments. So I think analytically, I think what we're seeing here is a very strong alignment with the man. This is I think the kind of refusal to do a community benefits agreement or anything that might look close to it, or something like strong, even if it's not a community benefits agreement. I mentioned inclusionary zoning policies. So these are things, Chicago has some inclusionary zoning. Often it's very weak. So inclusionary zoning means the following: any new development that usually needs some zoning variance or might go on some city land or the city can have some say in, must include a certain proportion of the housing for families defined in some way, either low-income families, moderate-income families, and that's where all the wiggle room comes. What percentage of the housing units need to be affordable? 10%? Well, that's a very low number in a community where the vast majority of the family's incomes are below the poverty line. So we need to think about the percentage being higher, and thinking about for what kinds of families, meaning our definition of low income or moderate income. So the big problem in New York is they have a pretty good inclusionary zoning law, but when you include families as needing affordable housing who make up to 100% of their median income, which is like $90,000 or some crazy amount because New York is so rich, then you never really get to families who are in the most need of housing. So inclusionary zoning would be, I think, a gesture that perhaps this plan isn't just kind of aligning with the man. I think I could have a lot more to say about that, yeah, but yeah.
Thank you for that talk. We could have used you last night at a very lively forum that I got dragged into moderating on U of C's campus about the Obama Presidential Center. And one of the things, I think I agree with you that it's not, that this moment is not a historical rupture, although from 1945 to now, sort of the class dynamics within the African American community are very different. And the dynamic of having had an African American president, what I listened to last night, and I think this wasn't the predominant view, but there were a lot of community folks, there were a lot of folks with a lot of power, black folks from the community, who were very protective because there has been this racist backlash against Obama and all that. So, but very protective. And so, and I felt there were working class folks too who were very protective of Obama and this sort of romanticized notion of black community that glosses over class differences, right? It didn't help that there were white professors there, you know, talking more about the trees and the birds than the people. But I just, can you speak to the sense of community and racial solidarity that at times actually obscures people acting in their own material self-interest?
Yes, so I think you've outlined it well in this particular instance. Where I will say I have seen it in my own research is, again, the utilization, deployment of black middlemen and middlewomen, meaning a black figure to be the one to present a development project, say, in a neighborhood, where it might be a development firm that is not neither majority black nor has a lot of black employees, but has a black employee who can be the one to go present the project. And that, exactly what you're talking about, what we might call, you know, sense of linked fate, what we might call sense of shared interests and community and so on, means that when that representative who is now, you know, like the people who, that person brings with them the assumption that, yes, you are looking out for my best interest, so if you think this is a good idea, then it might actually be a good idea. So I think that's a way that, you know, many, both private developers and in the public sector, you know, bringing certain policies and so on, deploy black middlemen and middlewomen to build upon that sense of linked fate. But I will also say, I don't want to suggest that those of us, and I will say us, in Black on the Block, I try to be very transparent and honest about my own role as a black middlewoman in many such debates in the black community. I mean, if you were moderating that, you yourself also, we all are taking positions in these things, and we're trying to decide where we're going to align, and we try to align on the side of racial justice, and, you know, we hope to succeed most of the time. But I don't want to malign I don't want to malign individuals' motivations and intentions, because what I learned from studying the transformation of North Kenwood, Oakland, is that many folks who were, you know, fighting hardest to make sure property values would increase or that there would be less public housing in the neighborhood or these kinds of things, their motivation was also very much in what they believed to be the collective interest of black folks, including black low-income folks. So the argument that public housing, an abundance of public housing, an abundance of affordable housing, which North Kenwood, Oakland definitely has and continues to have more than other parts of the city, depresses black housing values, which it can, and then depresses black wealth, is, you know, an argument that has some support. And then when those of us, like the UIC report, find these vast disparities in the vast black-white wealth gap, people can make that argument that as a result, we need to further disperse public housing and not just concentrate it in black neighborhoods. So I want to not suggest that some black middlemen or black middlewomen are dupes or pawns or any such thing. Often the justification is just as race man, race woman as other justifications might be, but it's complicated. And that's the story of black politics, right? Black folks in all of our social movements hashing out these positions and these logics. We all think we're the most clear-eyed, but the logics do differ, and people, you know, feel justified in those logics. It's funny, being in this room with, you know, so many folks who have studied this, I feel like I would much prefer a dining room table and all of us sitting around and talking about this, because here I look like the expert on this topic when so many of you all are experts as well. So I saw Corliss. Did I see your hand, Corliss? No? Okay. Oh, hi, how are you? Goodness gracious. This is like a big old reunion, let me tell y'all. There's so many people in here.
Yeah, hi. How you were going around and do the book. And so now, what is it, 15 years later? I don't know how many years later.
Well, I mean, we both still live there,
Right,
but the book was published in 2007.
Right. So, but at least on the block where I'm still living, I see a different view now that when you did the book and what's happening now.
Share, please.
And so it disturbs me a little bit because then we saw, like you were describing, people that were trying to get the block together and make it a black kind of sense. And now that many of the older people that were there since 1950s have died, and then some of their grandchildren have lost the houses, and then now there's a whole different kind of demographic, which makes it different because it's not the same anymore, because the new residents have a different view than when we were doing it a few years back.
So one of my challenges in being an urban sociologist generally and doing the work in North Kenwood, Oakland, and in many other, and talking about the Obama Center is, cities change, neighborhoods change all the time, and I struggle with being too much of a traditionalist or, being stuck at a point and thinking things should never change. So that change is inevitable, and I think we need to continue to kind of document and ask questions about that change. I think, so we were neighbors, and every block, I think, in the neighborhood is different. And I do agree. So what I see in North Kenwood, Oakland, since the book was published, is my sense of its how fast it was going to change, how fast it was going to lose affordable housing, and so on, got kind of stalled right after the book was published with the mortgage crisis. So, and when I say stalled, and this is true in many other parts of the city, I mean like buildings half built, sitting there for 10 years. But there was a bright side to that for me on the side of equity and maintaining affordable housing, which is the demand kind of slowed, and as a result, you didn't have as much pressure on the affordable housing, and so the rental prices that I showed that haven't skyrocketed like the home owning prices, I think is partially a reflection of that. Now, so that's the kind of demography and economics of it. On the social side of it, I think that's the kind of what you see in a lot of changing neighborhoods, because stability breeds the kinds of neighborhood organizing that you are describing happened previously. And when new folks come, they're totally new, and they don't have the social connections there. Especially, higher income people are much more mobile, working as I do in Evanston and living on the South Side, are much more mobile in terms of the kinds of stores and so on that they can frequent. And I think that kind of mobility creates a lesser connection to the home place. So that would be my sense of kind of what's going on now.
Hi, it's working. Thanks. I wanted to ask, because you briefly alluded to earlier some of how what's going on with the recent election, how the Trump administration and their various antecedents have really framed a lot of issues around spaces that are inclusive, or they're trying to exclude Black people. But of course, a lot of the media narrative around, especially Black Chicago, has been about the gun violence, about Blacks, quote unquote, living in hell. And I'm curious from your perspective, and thank you for what you presented us with today. Where is the narrative and the media discrepant? Where do we need to pivot and shift to, and how?
That's just a tiny question. I'm thinking right now of the work of University of Chicago professor Forrest Stewart, who's working on a book on online music videos, kind of drill music, the various popular musics among Chicago's black youth, and the the information that we know that a lot of the violence often kind of gets started online. But in reading his book, which is an ethnography of young people in various groups, musical groups who put their videos online and battle basically online, but then some of those battles make it into real life and turn violent, I'm still struck by the axes of life in that music, despite how violent and misogynistic, kind of the same debates we would have about gangster rap, we can have about drill music and any of the contemporary music. So when I think about how the narrative needs to shift, what I think about is needing to meet, especially young people, since you're talking about violence, which is kind of mostly among a younger demographic, meeting young people where they are. I think what often happens is we see the music, we see the stuff online, and we immediately say, we got to shut all this down because we just got to shut it all down, basically. It's criminogenic, it's what's creating violence and so on. And in doing that, we miss the creativity, the wordplay, the language of it, the catharsis of it, because he makes this point that for the young people he was hanging out with, this very kind of rapid fire music was a release instead of kind of committing violence themselves. So I think capitalizing on the creativity part without wholly dismissing and not wholly dismissing the whole art form as kind of sustaining or exacerbating violence would be one way that I think the narrative needs to shift. So I'm a big fan of, surprisingly enough, because I've always said to friends, I don't understand poetry. So surprising enough, I am a big fan of like Louder Than a Bomb and other kind of poetry interventions in among Chicago public school students and so on and so forth. And so that I could imagine, again, it's all about resources. If we support those kinds of endeavors to expand even more and create more options for black youth to be creative in whatever way they want to be creative, that shows that we value them. Amanda mentioned I'm part of this group called the African American Legacy, that Corliss is here, one of my co-conspirators in this, and we had a grant-giving effort called Voice Not Violence, and the attempt was exactly that. If we foster young people's voices and we tell them that their voices mean something and that we value them and we want to hear them, then we think that's one of the steps away from violence. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to underplay at all. Folks need jobs. Folks need schools that teach. I'm not trying to underplay the economics of all this, but that's the first thing that came to mind when you talked about changing the narratives and focusing on these axes of life as opposed to the negative side.
Thank you very much. I have a bit of concern. The concern is twofold. Mm-hmm. One is by analyzing Chicago as just being a product of the South Side and Bronzeville, I think there's a grave error. Mm-hmm. Because to ignore the West Side and ignore the dynamics between the West Side and the South Side, especially in terms of class mobilization and the formation of the black middle class in the city, is indeed quite mistaken. Mm-hmm. The second thing I'd like you to speak to is we're talking about a very political event, a historically political event. The appearance and now the demise of the black community here in Chicago. And a lot of that was the result of very specific political machinations and policies that I didn't hear reflected in your talk. For example, you have to analyze the Chicago Public Housing Authority and its policies and its role in relationship to Richard daily. You have to be able to speak to the question of white fear and white racism and white violence in terms of events like Trumbull Park riots in the 1950s. All of these factor in. And the last thing is there is now a new collection, and it is the South Side, South suburbs of Chicago. Those have been now systematically developed and now are a gathering ground, maybe for a transition of people back south, I don't know. But there is a deliberateness, an intent, a maliciousness that has been the cause of all of this, and I'd like to hear you speak more to that. I'm sorry it sounds hard-headed and cold, maybe.
No, not at all.
It's not as good as poetry, it's not as much fun, but it's very critical that we be very conversant in this history.
I couldn't agree more. You are hitting upon I think, a general quandary in my own career and maybe in the career of other people here, which is I teach everything you're talking about every day in my classes. And it's depressing, it's heavy, it is, spiritually and emotionally draining. And I have for years talked about it. I could give a number of books. My own book, especially Black on the Block, very much talks about public housing, the history of public housing, the history of that violence. The book begins with, tells the story of North Kenwood, Oakland, through the story of the house that I was living in, 4432 South Berkeley, where the race riots of 1919, there was a black man killed at 47th and Cottage Grove, just a couple of blocks away from Berkeley. And I tell the long story of the neighborhood through that house and the role of the Chicago Housing Authority, the role of the University of Chicago in funding racial restrictive covenants in the neighborhoods that surrounded the University of Chicago that were expressly meant to keep African Americans out, the house bombings that follow. So you're totally correct. There's no question about it. And I continue to teach those things. It's not like now I'm like, okay, I know all of that, so my students don't need to know it. Not at all. In all of my classes, I teach an intro urban sociology class. I teach a class called Black Chicago. We learn all of those things. What you're hearing from me today is partially, perhaps also what motivated me to become an academic and which I feel like I lost and now I'm trying to get back to, which is when I was an undergraduate, the book that was the book at the time was William Julius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged, the title of which says it all. It's a study of black neighborhoods, mostly in Chicago, which are the home to, as he calls, the truly disadvantaged. This ushered in decades of what we call poverty research that focus on black neighborhoods and focus on all of the despair in black neighborhoods. So focuses on drugs and violence and gangs and out-of-wedlock births and all of the things that sociologists focus on. And when I went to graduate school, I was already feeling like that is not the entirety of the black community. It's not the entirety of the black experience. So I wanted to study the black middle class. And my first book, Black Picket Fences, is a study of the black middle class. But even it's not like when you study the black middle class, you say, okay, shoo, this group is fine. So let me talk about all the great things that the black middle class has experienced. Not at all. Black Picket Fences, the subtitle is Privilege and Peril Among the Black Middle Class. And so there I, too, also talk about redlining, housing differentials in housing wealth, education, so on and so forth. So I got into studying the black middle class because I felt like all the depressing things that William Julius Wilson had been writing about was only half the story. Then I got sucked back into all the depressing things about black neighborhoods. And I'm once again at a moment. It's not that, as I ended my talk, it's not that I think we need to stop studying racism, which still exists, obviously, disinvestment, decisions by banks, decisions by city planners, and so on. it's that always needs to be balanced with a reminder of what Drake and Katyn told us, the axes of life. And, few of us have 900 pages to write a book. Drake and Katyn, Black Metropolis, is 900 pages. So few of us can have a whole 300 pages on the Black ghetto and a whole 300 pages on Black Metropolis and then, 600 pages for other. It's a long book. So most of us have to do one or the other in an article or in a book or in a talk. And so I'm trying in my scholarship overall, and I think in the conversation about Black communities, to offer some of that balance, to remind us, we're in a moment of Black Lives Matter, to remind us about Black lives and the things that Black folks do every day. It's unfortunate that we need such reminding, but as the gentleman who talked about the narrative completely obscures all of that life in Black Chicago. And as you all well know, you go anywhere and say you're from Chicago, and people go, ooh, is it really as bad as people say? And so that is so dominant that I think it's necessary to balance it out. On the West Side point, total, take the critique. We specialize, we focus. My research has all been on the South Side, and it's unfortunate that there isn't as much research on the West Side to even draw on.
Let's take one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
clearly, for all the aforementioned. My question is there sort of, we've talked about and we've heard about how there's a Black pruning of Black Chicago as it pertains to the spaces that we occupy, especially in housing and such. Do you think that there's a correlation between that and Chicago's public schools? Do you think that, as we know in the news now, that of course large numbers of Black Chicagoans are moving out of the city, do you think there's a correlation as it pertains to education and the closures of schools in Chicago?
Yeah, so I think it is very easy, and the logic is unimpeachable that population decline means there will be school under-enrollment, and thus the Chicago Board of Education can say that it is financially not feasible to run schools where the numbers of students have declined. And, it's dangerous, but I shouldn't say it's dangerous. Some schools may have to close. But how they close, and I think this argument is the same that I would make about public housing, that I have made about public housing, which is more where my research has been rather than schools, and that's why I didn't talk about it that much. But how they close. So, in the public housing realm, it was kind of move people out first and plan later. And so what you have are decades of vacant land because you moved everybody out, you demolished it, and now the money's not there, or the market's not there, or whatever, and now you just have vacant space. And whereas what you could have done was you have phased developments, you could move people to parts of the development, many public housing developments were underpopulated, so it would have not been difficult to have phased developments so that people could have stayed in place and perhaps would have been more likely to have come back to those developments or just moved to the newer part of the development once it was developed. So I think the same thing has happened in the public school system. It's like, get everybody out and plan later. It's an incredible lack of vision for a group of people who are called planners, right? Urban planners are supposed to plan, but it seems as if the plan is like a 1 or 2 year plan. So I think my point about the school closings is that it could be possible and likely that some schools will close. But how do we do that without young people thinking the school is closed because I'm bad or because my test scores weren't good enough or that kind of internalization? How can we do it with care? How can we create the social services and supports that wrap around kids before we close a school? And all of this also applies to public housing as well, none of which happened in either case.
Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.